There's a lot of information to share with you today. I thank you for participating through our snowstorm. It's a moment like this where I'm glad we have Zoom to rely on for our technology. My name is David Richards. I'm the director of the Margaret Chase Smith Library. I'm coming to you today from the library, and I'm joined by two of my staff members, Nicole Potter and John Taylor, who are working remotely and will be assisting with the presentation today, some of the technical aspects of it. And I just want to go over a couple of the etiquette rules. We ask people to stay on mute because we have a lot of people who have signed up to participate today. We ask you to submit any questions you might have along the way through the chat button at the bottom of your screen. If things become unstable for you watching the presentation, you can always click your video off, and that may make it a little more stable. You can also control your view. I think in the upper right, there should be a button or some dots that will allow you to either speaker or gallery view. We are recording this and we are using closed captions, and there's a note in the chat box telling you how you can make the closed caption work. So I welcome you to our annual Leeke-Shaw lecture on international affairs. And the first thing I need to do is thank our benefactors, who are Ada Leeke and Evelyn Shaw. They were friends of Margaret Chase Smith, who gave money many years ago for us to be able to do a lecture every year on international affairs. And I thank all of you for showing up and being interested in this topic. And I also thank Mid-Maine Global Forum, which is our co-sponsor for this event. We picked the theme for the Mid-Maine Global Forum in the year to come on the topic of migration. And right around the time we picked that topic, I was noticing that the Bangor Daily News had hired a new reporter, and one of her areas of interest or expertise background was Afghan refugees. And so I contacted her and we negotiated for a while. She was new to Maine and needed some time to settle in, and eventually consented to be our speaker for today. And she is Mehr Sher, who has a very impressive background for someone being so young. And she was born in Pakistan, grew up in the United States. She graduated from the North Carolina State University and with a degree in international relations. Then went to Pakistan and was a journalist for 6 years there at many different forms of media. She was a broadcast journalist. She was a print journalist, wrote columns, got involved in digital media, and also did documentary work as well. After that, she decided that she really wanted to pursue investigative journalism and enrolled at the Columbia School of Journalism. And upon completion of that, we find her here in Bangor, Maine, working for the Bangor Daily News, and she will be covering more of her background as she talks about her topic today. We had a pre-meeting last night, and one of the things I said to her, and it really is the way that she's organized this talk today, is I have a friend who is a gifted and talented teacher named Larry Ross, and he's always telling his kids, how do you know, what do you know? And that's really the approach Mehr is going to take today. You can see from the title that she's going to be talking about Afghan refugees from the standpoint of not being a refugee, not being an aid worker, but as a journalist who has covered this story in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in the United States. So with that, I present our speaker, Mehr Sher. Good morning, Mehr, or good afternoon at this point.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for joining me, everybody. I'm just having a little bit trouble with this opening up this presentation. If you just give me one moment, I'm gonna pull it up. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Mehr Sher, and I'm an investigative reporter covering the environment at the Bangor Daily News here in Maine. I am here through a program called Report for America, which places journalists in local newsrooms to strengthen specific coverage areas. I am also a Pulitzer Center reporting fellow and will be covering Taliban rule in Afghanistan with their support. My coverage areas are conflict, migration, and environment, and my regional focus is on the United States, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Just today, I published a piece on the female education ban in Afghanistan for a magazine called New Lines. Before I get into the rest of the presentation, I thought it would be worthwhile to just talk a little bit about my path to journalism and my background. I knew I wanted to be a journalist from a very young age. I grew up in the United States with 9/11 and the war on terror front and center. Very early on, I was exposed to regular media coverage of places and people who share my heritage. A brown kid, American, Muslim, Pakistani, and Pashtun, trying to reconcile her identity with images and narratives in the media. This coverage influenced my decision to become a journalist and to seek truthful narratives. After college, I moved abroad to Pakistan, where I was based for almost 6 years. I started my journalism career there in broadcast. I also co-founded a production company called Arash Visuals and produced documentary films on various socio-political issues. Last year, I moved back to the United States for my formal training in investigative journalism at the Columbia Journalism School, where I got my master's degree. I switched gears to print journalism over the past year and a half. Throughout my career, I have often found myself covering issues related to Afghan refugees and migrants, whether it was in Pakistan or here in the United States in Indiana and New York. It's a subject I'm naturally drawn to. Over the past few months, however, I have been focused on building expertise in environment and climate reporting, which I consider one of the biggest conflicts of our time. Before I begin, I'd like to make it clear once more that I'm speaking solely from my perspective as a reporter. So this presentation is focused on the journalistic side of things, as well as takeaways from my own reporting, and does not reflect the views of any outlet I have worked with in the past or currently work with. It is simply impossible to do a quick recap. I'm sorry, is this slide still on the first one? Has someone changed that slide? The next one, please. Thank you. It is simply impossible to do a quick recap of the past 4 decades of conflict in Afghanistan, but it is also impossible to talk about any of this without context. So while I don't want to spend more than a couple of minutes here, I do want you all to take a good look at this timeline to get a sense of the span of conflict and the different waves of migration that it resulted in, while I briefly walk you through it. For over 40 years, Afghanistan has faced persistent wars, violence, instability, poverty, and food insecurity. This dates back to the 1978 coup, which began a civil war, paving the way for the Soviet invasion. By 1989, 7% to 9% of the Afghan population had been killed. Afghan refugees represent one of the largest, what is called a protracted refugee population. Since the 1979 Soviet invasion, there have been 4 waves of migration out of Afghanistan. In that first wave alone, by 1980, there were more than 4 million refugees in Pakistan. Before the war on terror led to the US invasion in October 2001, preceding conflicts had already killed, wounded, or displaced half of the population. By 2003, many Afghans, in fact, moved back to the country from neighboring refugee host countries, expecting stability, which was short-lived and in pockets in a conflict-ridden country. Throughout the different waves of migration, Pakistan has served as a host nation for the largest Afghan refugee population, followed by Iran. But most of this migration takes place to Pakistan as either a point to head west and seek asylum in Europe or the United States, or to remain somewhere familiar with the hopes of returning to their own country one day. If you look at the map up there, it's an older map, and you can see where the Soviet Union was in juxtaposition. And you see Iran to the west and Pakistan to the east. So if you look at that map, migration from Afghanistan has often been along ethnic lines, with most from Western Afghanistan choosing to migrate to Iran, and most from Eastern Afghanistan choosing to migrate to Pakistan. Compared to Iran and Pakistan, there is more opportunity for education for refugees. In both countries, however, refugees face many challenges, as they do the world over, be it exploitation, lack of resources, and lack of upwards mobility, documentation issues, potential arrests for lack of documentation, and forced repatriation. By 2021, with the US withdrawal and Taliban takeover of Afghanistan on August 15th, the country has been hit hard further by sanctions, economic collapse, instability, severe food insecurity, increasing poverty, and the failure of institutions such as health and public services. Many Afghans have since been displaced, many for what is the second or third time in 4 decades. Some who worked with foreign troops, foreign government-funded projects, and non-governmental organizations were fortunate to be evacuated to the United States or Europe, while many escaped to neighboring Iran or Pakistan. As of 2021, nearly 80% of the newly displaced Afghans are women and children. This prolonged cycle of conflict and migration continues as the political and economic situation in Afghanistan continues to deteriorate. The United States evacuated more than 120,000 people from Afghanistan, most of which, more than 76,000, came through Operation Allies Welcome for those who cooperated with the US forces during the war. But we'll talk more about this later. So if you look at the news coverage on Afghanistan, particular emphasis has been given to the country during peak periods of conflict, most notably during the first decade of the War on Terror, when much of our international coverage focused on Afghanistan. When I talk about the coverage, I'm speaking broadly here, of course. And that being said, through the past 4 decades, there have also been several dedicated journalists who have tirelessly worked to keep important issues front and center and have established a level of expertise on the region. But in the earlier stages of the War on Terror, reporting on Afghanistan lacked nuance. This was more prevalent in broadcast coverage, where reporting has to be more instant and networks are racing to be the first on the scene. Reporting on conflict in a vacuum without historical context can often lead to a lack of accuracy, incomplete information, and misinformed narratives. It's very evident when coverage of any conflict is coming from a place of little historical knowledge, or when a reporter hasn't done their basic research. Not every news report can give full historical background, but having that knowledge provides an opportunity to explain and frame a conflict better. When it came to reporting on Afghan women, we've seen the use of Orientalist tropes of the veil and expressions such as "save Afghan women." This rhetoric in Western media has often been propagated, and it's disempowering. I think it's important to talk about how this discourse in journalism is more reductive than it is empowering. Oppressive policies can be reported on without playing on the victimhood of women. The images of women that made the most waves in the media over the past 20 years were those of women in burqas. And it's important to also think about how the images that we use, how we use them, and what many of those images that we are using are telling. Are they telling a complete picture? What purpose are they serving? What do they reveal? Could there be more variety to show more of these nuances? So I want to use the image on this slide, often called the Afghan Girl by Stephen McCurry, as an example of what I'm talking about here. It's one of the most famous images in the world, and it's considered iconic. I want you to think about this image to yourself. What does it show you? What does it portray? And I'm going to pause here on this slide while you guys think about this. You don't have to share what it portrays, but just take a moment to really look at it and think about it for a moment. What does it show you? I see a young girl visibly upset in tattered clothes. I'm sure there are some here who know the story of this image, but for those that don't, the woman pictured here, her name is Sharbat Guda. She was 8 years old when this image was taken by Stephen McCurry at the Nasser Bagh refugee camp in Peshawar in 1984 at an all-girls school in the refugee camp. A Pashtun from Nangarhar, she is among millions of other Afghans who fled to Pakistan after her village was bombed by the Soviets. For 18 years, her identity was not known, and she unknowingly became a symbol for Afghanistan the world over. In an interview with the Afghan outlet Tolo News, she said she herself didn't realize how widespread her image had become until 17 years later. For McCurry, this image was significant, of course, and especially for his career. And he rose to fame and got a lot of recognition for the Afghan Girl. The caption in the National Geographic, when it was published, read, "Haunted eyes tell of an Afghan refugee's fears." And this caption provides little to no context about who she is or her story or her fears. Whether or not she consented is also heavily debated. For many women, it can be an intrusion, especially in cultures where some may choose to cover and don't want to be photographed. Of course, I'm not saying that this is the case all across the country or with all women, but there are women who genuinely don't want their face to be plastered all over the world, who don't want to be photographed. And this image was taken again for context in an all-girls school in the refugee camp. Years later, in that interview that I'm referring to with Tolo News, she said she was upset, and so was her family, indicating that she had not given her consent to having her image taken at the time. She spent a difficult life as a refugee in Pakistan for 35 years, and after the takeover, had to leave once again. When asked about her life as a refugee and her displacement, this is what she said, with a distant look in her eyes. She said, "There is no home like your own country." And I believe this interview was maybe 1 to 2 years before the Taliban takeover. Now, there are, of course, moments such as during active conflict on the front lines, where it's hard for us reporters to stop and to get those important details. But otherwise, it is integral to do the journalism and to identify someone, interview them, give them agency, and let them give you their consent before photographing them, interviewing them, or writing about them. Women and children, especially in any conflict, are most vulnerable. And in situations such as these, it's of utmost importance to seek consent and explain how the material will be used and who the intended audience will be. And in her case, it would have also been important to seek the consent of one of her guardians or her parents. This kind of work is emblematic of the fetishization of girls and women of war, reducing them to unnamed beings with no agency to make their own decisions, even about being photographed or written about. McCurry has done a lot of important work, and I don't debate that. But while for many this image is a symbol of Afghan women, for me it encapsulates unethical journalism. It is a portrayal of how extractive the process becomes without basic journalistic principles. Media narratives and extractive behaviors of reporters have led to a lot of fatigue among Afghan refugees. While many are eager to share their stories with Western media, many are also fatigued of feeling disempowered in the process. And I ran into this frequently, even last year with the new wave of Afghan refugees in the United States. It was incredibly hard to win trust, to source, and to report on Operation Allies Welcome. And if you all remember, especially in the first few months of the evacuation and of the takeover, there was very little character-driven coverage in the first couple of months. People were traumatized by the takeover and exhausted by the media attention and previous interactions with the press. Being someone who often ran into refugees that I shared the same heritage with or language with, it was still difficult for me even to be able to do this work and to gain their trust. And moving on to the next topic, the important role of journalism. Journalism plays an important role in documenting stories, providing accurate information, holding institutions accountable, and in turn shaping the understanding and perception of the events that unfold. For Afghanistan and Afghan refugees around the world, it is important to continue this coverage, not only in times where foreign interests of events draw attention, but also when most aren't watching what's happening. Right now, with very little on-the-ground reporters, it is more important than ever to continue to tell these important stories with as much accuracy and fact-checking as possible, and to document what's taking place within Afghanistan under Taliban rule, as well as outside of Afghanistan with the resettlement process of refugees. So I want to take a moment here to demystify the process of reporting ethically on vulnerable communities. I'm sure there are some reporters in this lecture, but I'm sure that majority of you are not and are not familiar with this process. So as reporters, we often get blindsided by our work and our process, and it's important to remember that we're human first and then a reporter. The reason I say this is because when reporting on vulnerable communities or people who are either living in or have fled conflict, trust needs to be built. The process is voluntary for those who speak to us in vulnerable communities, and we are not entitled to people's stories. It is a privilege for us to be entrusted by those who choose to share their life's most challenging moments. Sources must have a say in whether or not they would like to share their story, and if so, which parts of it. There may be some details they are uncomfortable sharing, and journalists have to respect that. Additionally, having trauma-informed reporting skills is crucial for this kind of coverage. We have to understand how the experience our sources are sharing with us affects them, and how our reporting and putting that information out there in the world could affect them further. And it's important to have these honest conversations with sources. And this is where that trauma-informed reporting skill or those strategies are important. Many people may be speaking to a reporter for the first time in their lives, and even if they aren't, it's important for us to assume that and to always explain the process and explain the jargon on the record, off the record, on background. We have to explain our methodology to the people we are covering. We have to talk about what our story is about, what the interviewing process entails, what material will be used, where the story will feature or is likely to feature, and who will see it. It's important to give people a sense of what it means to have this information out there in the world so that they can make an informed choice to participate. Knowing enough about the culture is also important. It's important to respect people's social norms and to speak to them on their comfort level, not ours. And lastly, I found that more often than not, my sources, while I've been covering this issue, my sources have shared more with me than I think would be safe for them to share so openly. And so as reporters, we also have to be mindful of the risks and the consequences for our sources, and remind them that perhaps this bit of information that you've shared, maybe, this is not going to add value to the story, and it could put you at further risk. So we have to secure our sources, especially if they're coming from vulnerable communities, from conflict, or from migrant communities, and people who have some sort of trauma. It's important for us to protect and secure them. Some of these people have worked in sensitive positions, and others have family or loved ones still in Afghanistan, and sharing certain details could make them or their loved ones identifiable and at risk. Having a grasp on potential risks helps journalists navigate these conversations and ensure that we do our best to protect our sources. Now, moving on to my reporting on the Afghan Refugee Resettlement Program, I want to share my takeaways from that process. I want to share a bit about my reporting process and also Rehan's story with all of you. This was a very challenging story for me to do, as I mentioned earlier, although I have an advantage of having an overlapping heritage, culture, and being able to speak Pashto. It was still very hard for me to develop sources when I was reporting on this program. And so initially my approach was community immersive, showing up at communal spaces such as mosques and businesses, and getting to know the Afghan community in New York and telling them about my work, telling them, what kind of stories I'm looking to tell. And so I decided on this approach after many organizations turned me down, in all honesty. Virtually all refugee organizations and resettlement agencies declined to connect me with potential sources, potential refugees who would be willing to share their stories. And that made me even more adamant to pursue the story and maybe realize that there really must be a lot out there for me to cover. So by being present in the community, I connected with wonderful people that were always more than welcoming toward me. I assume it was mostly because of my heritage more than anything. They allowed me into their spaces and shared their food with me. But that being said, in my role as a reporter, it was very hard to win trust. Often people were fearful because of years of surveillance of the community post 9/11. And reporters using extractive methods that put people at risk. And other times community leaders would want to help and would know of recent Afghan refugees, but when they asked them, the refugees would decline, either out of fatigue, fear of being re-traumatized, or fear of the consequences of speaking to reporters and potential risks to their loved ones. Eventually, a community leader, and I believe this was after a month or so of just going in circles and trying to tell people about the story that I want to do, why it matters, and spending time within those communities and building those connections. Eventually, a community leader connected me with somebody who was helping Afghan refugees in a more informal role, and she was helping them with translation. The woman spoke to several of the refugees she was working with, and finally, one person agreed. And by coincidence, he only spoke Pashto. He did not speak Farsi nor English. So we spoke over the phone briefly initially, and I got a sense for what his story was. But I knew that there was obviously so much that one wouldn't necessarily share in just a short phone call. And so I asked him once again for his consent, because I heard through somebody else, right, that he had consented, but it was important for me to make him feel empowered and to decide whether or not he wanted me to share his story. And so I asked him once again if he was sure he was comfortable sharing it, if he was sure he was willing to go through a lengthy interviewing process, and which would entail me going to meet with him several times. And so he agreed. I met with him in person a few days later in New Jersey. I spent the day with him. We agreed that given his work and other factors, we would have to maintain anonymity. and decided on the name Rehan. It's a name he chose to be identified with, one that he was very excited to pick for himself. And he was very enthusiastic about that. It was a name that he chose to be identified with, which is something that I've made clear in the story, that he was given a pseudonym to protect his identity because of the sensitive nature of the work that he did. His entire family still lives in Afghanistan, and it was important to make him feel secure, but still be able to get the facts, verify them, and tell his story. Because I didn't rush to just get quotes and walk away, I think one of the main learnings that I've had over the years, and especially over the past year when I was doing this kind of reporting more so, is that this is not the kind of reporting that you quickly, get into an interview, get your quotes, jump out. This is one of those beats where you really have to be patient. You have to be patient with the process, patient with the comfort level of your sources, and patient with establishing that trust and that credibility before you can get that story. And so because I didn't rush just to get the quotes and actually took the time to get to know him beyond his refugee status, as a person, and I let him decide if he wanted to participate, gave him that agency, which we should all have, and explained my reporting process. Even during the interview, if something was very sensitive, I often asked if he was sure that it could be on the record and it wouldn't jeopardize him in any way. So I was able to establish trust and credibility with him through this rigorous process. Often he was very forthcoming, and over the course of our meetings and conversations, he shared many sensitive things, most of which I did not report on in the story for people to read, because it didn't necessarily add value to the story that I was trying to tell. It wasn't something that would have made, or, it wasn't a make or break moment for the story. And it didn't, if anything, it would be compromising for Rehan and for his family and loved ones back home. But I also couldn't solely depend on hearsay or what he said, and that is not to discount his story or his experiences, but more so because I have to fact check everything that I possibly can as much as possible. And so I verified whatever I could through paperwork. He was very generous to show those documents to me, many of which he didn't even realize, because he can't read English. He didn't realize contained a lot of details of a sensitive nature, particularly with regard to his work. And I had to let him know that. I had to let him know what was in these documents. I had to let him know that, listen, thank you for sharing all of this with me. The stuff that is relevant for me, I've been able to confirm, but also there are documents in here you should really not be so willing to share with somebody just like that, because they're of a sensitive nature. And so he was trusting, and sometimes to a fault. And that's where it's important for a reporter to be cognizant of that. We went over the details several times about what I was allowed to share and what I was allowed to write about, just to make sure that there would be no surprises for Rehan one day when he is able to read this story for himself. And moving on now to the main takeaways of the program and Rehan's story. Since the US military withdrawal and Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in August 2021, close to 100,000 Afghans have been evacuated or brought to the United States. In the first few months, more than 76,000 had been evacuated through Operation Allies Welcome, making it one of the largest resettlement, programs, if not the largest, to the United States in decades. Last year, when I was reporting on this story, New York State had accepted 2,111 Afghan evacuees, with 2,255 expected to be resettled in the state, according to data obtained from state authorities. New Jersey at the time had welcomed at least 700 evacuees and processed thousands through its military base at Fort Dix. Resettlement agencies assisting Afghan evacuees are required to provide them housing and financial support for food and other basic needs during the resettlement period. The Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, partnered with 9 agencies to resettle Afghan evacuees around the country. Now, not all evacuees are treated equally. Afghans evacuated on a special immigrant visa, SIV, like Rehan, are eligible for more benefits, including cash assistance, medical assistance, career services, English language training, and other services offered through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. But other evacuees do not meet the criteria for the SIV program, including Afghans who worked with US government-funded projects, such as or US media organizations or non-governmental organizations. And these evacuees are given a priority 2 or P2 designation. The final category of evacuees are those on humanitarian parole, and they are the most vulnerable. These Afghans are in the US on a temporary basis while they seek a long-term solution for resettlement in the United States or another country. And that may or may not happen, but they are unable to access resettlement agencies and these benefits unless they earn a more permanent status, such as SIV or asylee, which is incredibly hard and not very common. For this story, among several other sources, I also interviewed a California immigration lawyer, Spojne Nasiri, who toured Fort Dix and other US military bases housing Afghan evacuees. And she told me that thousands of evacuees are in a legal limbo. When many evacuees were cleared to leave the military bases, and this I'm talking about, I believe the last group of that first group of 76,000 refugees that left the military bases was in February of last year. And so when many evacuees were cleared to leave the bases for resettlement, there were many who didn't have documentation. And to this day, there are people without work permits who can't enroll even their children in schools. Now I'm gonna talk about Rehan's story and tell you all a bit about him, and through his story, also walk you through some of the gaps and the shortcomings of the resettlement program. So the first time I met Rehan, he was my age, he was 29 years old. I remember I saw him, he stood waiting outside his new temporary home. He wore khaki jeans and a light sweatshirt. He was incredibly underdressed for the frigid New Jersey winter. And I remember his hazel eyes were swollen and red-rimmed from lack of sleep. In fact, he had endured a personal loss during that time, something I wasn't aware of, and still took out the time to meet with me for that first time and gave me, and was so generous with his time to talk to me about his story. His tan face looked weathered beyond his years. And when I walked up to him and greeted him, it wasn't until then that I saw his face light up in a boyish grin. So Rehan was evacuated from Afghanistan on a special immigrant visa, as I told you earlier, or an SIV, which was offered to Afghans who were employed by or on behalf of the US government. But like thousands of other evacuees in this country today, Rehan is struggling to rebuild his life. His story offers insights into the challenges of scores of Afghan evacuees who have been living in the country for anywhere between more than 1 year to several months now. They are navigating an under-resourced, cash-strapped, federally funded resettlement program. Rehan's evacuation began in 2021 while the Taliban captured city after city across Afghanistan, and he received instructions from the US officials to leave his native Paktia province for Kabul airport. He could only hope that he'd make it alive on the road to the airport. It was a long distance for him to travel. And when he got there were throngs of people waiting to leave the country. But his fear didn't subside. and this was due to the nature of Rehan's work on behalf of the US military. He was not certain he would make it out alive even from the airport. After 3 days of waiting at the airport, surviving on the bare minimum of biscuits and water, he finally boarded a military plane to Qatar amid the chaos. From there, he boarded another plane and arrived in the US 2 more flights later. He was told that he would be questioned for a few minutes when he arrived, but for 2 days, he was interviewed by US officials, even though he had all his paperwork and everything showing the work that he had done, which, as I told you, was very detailed. There were translators interpreting who spoke Farsi and very little Pashto, and their words were unintelligible to Rehan. Often interpreters who are hired don't always have the linguistic capacity for people of different ethnicities. And so because Rehan is an ethnic Pashtun who understands neither English nor Farsi, his words were unintelligible, the interpreters, to him. And so he was very confused about the whole process. So finally, after 2 days, Rehan and the others were escorted to buses that took them to the Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. There, he went through immigration and held screenings. He was given a case number, and he got into the habit of checking every single night whether or not he was approved for resettlement. And he stayed on that base for 4 months. And when I met him last winter, he had just moved off the base. It had been a few weeks, and he had finally gotten the chance to resettle. When his case number was posted for resettlement, he was paired with an agency, and through that agency, he relocated with a few other evacuees to a home in Newark, New Jersey, which is where I met him last winter. Now, every week, a case officer from the agency would visit Rehan and give him $50 to spend. He would try to stretch an entire week's worth of spending into that amount. He was told that he would only be given this budget for 6 months and these benefits for 6 months. And at the time that we first met, he was about 1 month in. So he was very concerned about being able to find employment and being able to sustain himself, not speaking the language, not really knowing the way of life here, and how to maneuver, how to navigate the United States. He showed me also tattered and used clothes that the resettlement agency gave him and his housemates. There were pants, shirts, sweaters, and sweatshirts. But what I noticed was that there was no winter coat or jacket at all. And he said that the clothes that they had given them remained unworn and nobody wanted them. And here's why. Rehan said to me, "These are not just lightly used, they are worn out and shabby. We are not beggars. We came to this country because we worked with the US government." And that's something that stayed with me. Several times a week, he would walk around all over the city looking for work. Now, when I told you guys earlier about the SIV visa and resettlement through that, refugees are entitled also to career services. But he didn't really have that support. And so often he felt left to his own devices. So he would walk around all over Newark and other places looking for work. He started using an app called Hi Translate to communicate with shopkeepers and managers. What he would do is he would type in Pashto and it would translate to English. And then he would share that message with shopkeepers or people he would be speaking to. They would type into the app in English, it would translate to Pashto. And so he went through this channel of communication. And even though he went through this process, almost going door to door looking for work, he was turned down over and over because he didn't speak English. And so he requested the agency for English lessons, and the lessons were given. They were given virtually, but it wasn't useful because the instructor didn't understand Pashto, and of course the evacuees didn't understand English. And so it was counterproductive, and after 3 days of putting up with it, he eventually stopped. Instead, again, he turned to his own devices. He looked up more helpful videos on YouTube to learn the basics that he could use. And today, Rehan remains in limbo, and he lacks the support to truly resettle in the country. The lawyer assigned to his case, to my knowledge, and to what he shared with me last when I spoke to him, still hasn't given him any clarity about where his case stands as an SIV holder, and he's unsure about what the future holds. And I want to end his story on the following quote, the quotes from the story. He said, "I want to stay here, of course, and build a good life with my family. But how can I truly be happy? My country has been destroyed. My father, mother, wife, and children are left behind, and I am here all alone. I was brought to this country, and I feel I am not even getting a fraction of what I deserve, considering the services I have provided." And this doesn't just echo Rehan's sentiments. I believe this gives us a glimpse into what Afghan allies who have supported and worked with the US government for over 2 decades, who came through these programs in the past year and a half. I believe that what he said here truly echoes those sentiments. And so I'd like to end the presentation here. Thank you all for listening to me. I'd like to open up the floor now to your questions. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. And again, I appreciate you all for joining me and listening to me. Also, I do want to mention that if you have any other questions that I'm not able to get to during this time, or if you also have news tips for me for any of my coverage areas, you can feel free to email me at the email address on your screen, msher@bangordailynews.com. I'm going to turn over the mic to the speaker now.
Thank you, Mehr, for your presentation, for sharing your background as a journalist and your story of what you've learned about Afghan refugees. And I usually exert my prerogative as the host to ask the first question, but since I had the chance to talk to you last night, I'm going to open it up to the floor. If there are any people out there on Zoom who have questions to direct to Mehr, you can unmute yourself and ask them. Otherwise, I'll exert my privilege.
I have one here, Mark Merrill. I'm a journalist myself, ma'am, for about 29 years, mostly in Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. But the first question I have is, how do state governments get prepared for either asylum seekers or refugees?
My name's Mehr.
Mehr, sorry.
No worries. Thank you so much for your question. I want to reiterate that the questions that I'll be answering must be within my capacity as a reporter. And from that perspective, I'm not a policymaker or a lawyer, so I can't really answer that question because it's outside of my domain. But I can share my observation, which I shared with you all earlier, is that the resettlement agencies are very cash strapped, and they've been that way since former President Donald Trump's presidency, his first term, and they've pretty much remained that way through President Biden's term as well. There isn't a lot of funding going into these programs, and so because of that, there are a lack of resources, and not just a lack of resources in terms of the benefits that can be offered to refugees, but also in terms of just having, some sort of relationship with communities that can offer a smoother transition during the resettlement process. So it's not just a loss in terms of what the United States can provide its allies as it resettles them, but it's also a loss in terms of having those deep communal relationships that, formerly evacuees or refugees and people who came to this country through such programs were able to benefit from, and that made that transition easier for them. So I hope that answers your question within my domain.
I appreciate it.
Anyone else have a question?
Yes, I'm I'm Steve Hode from Windsor, Maine. And I wondered, given the difference in culture, Mehr, if you can address the potential for culture shock. I understand you did some reporting in Afghanistan, and I just would be interested in your perspective on the culture shock of the refugee coming from Afghanistan to America.
Yeah, Steve, thank you for your question. I think that's a very important question and one that we don't often ask enough. And I did not report in Afghanistan. Let me just be clear on that, not yet anyway. But I have reported on these communities. It's definitely a culture shock. I don't think we realize how different things are in the United States. I mean, even if you went to Europe, you'd see a stark difference in what the US is like, what our culture is like, the way of life. And, our way of life is also very complex. It's very high tech. And so there's so many barriers for people who are coming from certain backgrounds from other countries where they don't have access to all these resources or often these complex programs and processes. Even our immigration process is very complex and difficult for people to understand. So there's shock when it comes to all of these things. And this is where usually a resettlement agency is so integral to make that transition easier and to give necessary information and educate people on how to even live here. In a lot of my conversations with my sources who work with refugees, they said that, I mean, more than anything, they needed to learn how to live here. How do you even pay for things and all of this stuff? So there's that shock, the shock of adjusting to a new way of life, which is very distinct from the rest of the world. And then there's also, of course, the culture shock. And, one of the things that I found, Steve, was that many of these people who have come through the fourth wave of migration to the United States, they also feel ostracized by the Afghan community in the United States, by the diaspora community. That is not to say that everybody is like that. There's a lot of support as well. But in Rehan's case, for instance, he did not feel like, the Afghan community looked at him with high esteem, or that they offered him a lot of help. And so it makes that adjustment even harder when you don't have people to help educate you and to kind of guide you through it, people from the same culture. I hope that answers your question.
Other questions?
David,
Yes.
Steve Knight here. I just want to point out, she may not know it, but we have an organization in Central Maine. Some of the people in this meeting know well about it. Capillary New Mainers Project, centered in Augusta. We are working with a number of Afghan families right now, Syrians. I mean, this has been going on 7 years now. And it takes a community of support team to make it work. I'm on one support team with an Afghan family. It's one of the most rewarding things you can do.
Steve, I'm well aware of the organizations that are working in Maine. Thank you so much for being here and for listening to my talk. And I'm very happy to hear about the work that you all are doing. I have not reported on this issue in Maine, but I'm aware of the resettlement taking place here as well.
And I know from some of the people who have registered that there are other people who have joined us today who are doing things with Afghan communities here in Maine. Other questions? So hearing a bit of a pause, I'll interject. I was interested, Mehr, what you just said with Rehan, the feeling with this fourth wave that they're not necessarily accepted by some of the earlier wave of Afghan refugees who've come to the United States. Is there a particular reason for that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to generalize, but I think for the most part, it's because of the work that they did and their cooperation with the US government and the US occupation of Afghanistan over the past 20 years. So the stigma comes from that, and they feel ostracized in the community, in the mosque spaces, And so there's that feeling of isolation as well. And that's not everywhere. I'm not referring to the entire country being this way, but there are places where it is very difficult, and where people need a little bit more support because the community is not willing to offer that and is not trusting of them for whatever reason.
Any other questions out there?
I believe there's some questions in the chat.
Yes, I see one here. It's asking about whether part of the issue with the Afghans is that coming from different ethnic backgrounds.
I don't think that's an issue. I think that there's always been migration from different ethnic backgrounds. I mean, there's, you know, a few ethnic backgrounds in Afghanistan, and the two main languages are Pashto and Farsi. I think people have always come from different ethnic backgrounds. In New York, the earliest migration of Afghan migrants was of Afghan Jews, and this took place in the 1900s. And so there's always been migration from different places. The problem is that we're more cash strapped today. Our resettlement agencies are ill-equipped to offer the services that we did in the past, which allowed for a much smoother transition to this country and a smoother process of resettlement. And I know many families who came through that process and have been doing great and have thrived in this country. But with this wave of migration, I see a lot more challenges.
Hello, David.
Yes, is that John?
Yes, John.
Menzinger?
Yes, hi, David. Yeah, I have a question in regard to Rahan's difficulty in learning English. We have some experience with the ESL English Second Language program, which is specifically designed for people who have no English at all. And it's usually a very, you know, with a motivated learner, it's a very successful program. So I'm wondering, you know, what the stumbling block is.
I think the stumbling block for him in his particular case, because that's the only case that I can speak about in depth, was that it was virtual. So there was no real, like, you know, connection. At least that's my observation. There was no real connection with the instructor. And also it was a class full of evacuees that don't speak a word of English and an instructor that doesn't really know how to communicate with them. And I think that was the main issue. I know how the ESL programs work and they can be successful, but they're also very rigorous and challenging for people to go through. And so his main issue was that. And it's also hard for people who are not on technology all the time, like we are, to even have that focus, you know, to sit in front of a computer and take a class like that.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I appreciate it. And I'd be more than happy to take any questions. They don't have to be just about this story. Also, if you guys have any other general questions about my work in Maine or anything else, please feel free.
I'm here, Mark Merrill again. One question, I don't know if you know the answer to it or not. Are refugees screened for like viruses, infections, whether they're vaccinated or not?
Yes, they go through, when I mentioned earlier, in Rahan's case and in all their cases, they go through health screenings at the, well, they went through health screenings at the military bases.
Great, I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, we were still in a pandemic, so the level of health screenings was definitely much higher for sure.
Other questions?
Don't
So,
be shy.
Mehr, you opened it up about other topics, and I believe, and this is my opportunity to say that this is only the tip of the iceberg of reporting that Mehr has done. For one thing, you can subscribe to the Bangor Daily News and read about the work that she's doing on the environment. I was just reading yesterday about some articles she was writing about solar power in Maine. And there's actually quite a bit of her work that is on YouTube. some of it being interviews done with her, some of it being some of the work that she did as a journalist in Pakistan. And she even has her own channel. So you can see some of the material that she's produced on her YouTube channel. And I believe I saw something on there about Yemeni refugees. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was a story of, she was not a refugee actually. Her story was very interesting because she was born in this country. Her father used to live here. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but in places like New York, there's a large Yemeni community. And if you are familiar as well or not, but Yemen has been going through a conflict since I believe 2011. And it's, an ongoing civil war, and humanitarian crisis, severe food insecurity. I mean, it's one of the countries that is really going through the worst situation as we speak. And so her story was unique because she was raised in Yemen. She was just born here, but her family lived in Yemen. She was raised there, and she had never really lived in this country until the war took place. She was the first girl in her family to get a high school education, and from there onwards, she's also going to be the first girl in her family. In fact, the first person probably to get such a high level education. She's on her way to become a doctor. And she's gearing up for medical school. But her journey just to the country and through Yemen was gripping. And so the video is on my channel. If you all are interested, you can feel free to watch it. But it's just about her journey and her life. Almost, immigrating to this country in a way mentally because she's not from here. She was born here, so.
There's a question from Joan Beckerman asking how you wound up in Bangor, Maine.
That's a wonderful question. I thought I addressed it in the beginning, but if I didn't, and if you missed it,
Yeah, some people had to come in late, and it was pointed out to me, some people have had to go out and talk to their plow drivers.
Oh my God, yes. I think we just got it done in my parking lot. I just saw them do it, in fact. A little late, but yeah, I wound up in Maine through a program called Report for America, which places emerging American journalists in different newsrooms across the country, specifically places that are news deserts. Now, Bangor is not a news desert. We have a thriving local paper here that covers the entire state. It's one of the best papers in the state. And so I came here for specific coverage to cover the environment and climate change issues, because, we have a lot of natural resources here. Maine seldom enters the national conversation on these key topics. And so I'm here through Report for America to work as a full-time environment reporter on the investigative desk at the Bangor Daily News. And if you look at my previous reporting, I think I've written about 23 stories now, looking into different issues from PFAS to the drought, to different climate change issues, climate resiliency, and a lot of solar power stories. I don't know why I'm so fascinated by solar energy, but it's become my thing, and you're going to see a lot more solar coming, I promise. So I've been looking into the community solar program recently, and the net energy billing that disproportionately affects low-income people.
Thank you. We are now after 1 o'clock, and this is designed as a lunchtime program, and Mehr is going to have to get back to work. But I want to, first of all, thank you for your presentation and give you an opportunity for a final word. Is there anything finally that you would like to share with the audience?
I think I've shared quite a bit that I came prepared to share with you guys. I really had to prepare well because it was in the middle of my work day, and I wanted to make sure that whatever I share here today would have been of quality and would, value your time as well that you're taking out of your days midday to hear me speak. So thank you so much for listening to me go on and on for about an hour. I appreciate it. I hope that you take away something constructive from this, whether it's, learning about reporting on vulnerable communities, or perhaps media literacy and understanding, when you look at reporting, really being critical and thinking about these things. Did they do their due diligence to protect these sources? And those things. And also, those of you who are working with refugees, or those of you with environmental concerns, if there are any news tips that you have for me, or any issues you're particularly concerned with, you can always feel free to email me at my Bangor Daily News email. It's msher@bangordailynews.com. And if you have any other questions, comments, anything about solar, you can send it my way.
So in the little time that I've known Mehr, she's very humble. And do you want to say anything about your passion project?
My investigative documentary?
Yes, the documentary.
Yeah, so I, a couple of years ago, this was 2020 actually, 2019, it was 2019, before the pandemic, before the world shut down. I was keeping up with a story on an HIV/AIDS outbreak in a province in the south of Pakistan, in Sindh. I was living there at the time, so I had taken a hiatus from my broadcast career and delved into filmmaking. And so I followed this story, archived everything I could find about it, and it was shocking to see that so many children were testing positive for HIV/AIDS in this one particular place. And now this one particular place is the home ground for one of the largest, most celebrated political parties in Pakistan, called the Pakistan People's Party. Some of you may be familiar with the former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. A lot of people are. She was the one who was the first female prime minister of Pakistan. She often wore a white veil, a beautiful woman, but that was her political party. And so the place where the outbreak took place was the home ground of that political party. And so I started keeping up with all of this stuff, looked deeply into it, started having conversations with international partners such as UNAIDS to understand what was going on. And so it all really came down to this one doctor who was a quack. Because health is a devolved subject in Pakistan, provinces are kind of in charge of regulating it for the most part. And so even in terms of the budget and oversight. And so there's a quack operating in this village in the city of this celebrated Benazir Bhutto and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and their political party. And he infected over 1,000 kids with HIV/AIDS, which at the time, I'm not sure what the figures say now, but it was the most concentrated outbreak in children in the history of this disease. There were many children that died. At the time, I think I reported 44 deaths. And one of the sources whose mother I interviewed and who features in the beginning of that documentary, she actually died during the course of the production of the film. And she was just a couple of months old. So it progressed very quickly in these children because they're malnutrition. They don't have access to adequate health care. And I raised these concerns in Islamabad, in the capital city, with these international partners. I raised my documentary with different embassies who initially were willing to help me screen it, and then backed out. And after they saw the content of it and realized I had not only unearthed the cause of the outbreak, but systemic failure, essentially, and a failure of healthcare. And so, yeah, so then the pandemic hit and that slowed down the screenings of it. But it was my passion project. As David rightly said, it was something that gave me that drive and made me realize that I want to do investigative journalism. This is what matters most to me. I want to look for the wrongdoing. Sometimes it's not there, then it's an explanatory piece, but when it is there, I'd be more than happy to report on it.
Thank you for sharing that. And again, if people want to know more, there's much more to learn about the work that Mehr has done in many different areas by going to YouTube and just typing her name in. And again, thank you, Mehr, for being with us today. And I want to give an opportunity, if Steve Knight, are you there? Do you want to talk about upcoming programs of the Mid-Maine Global Forum? And I don't see him running to unmute himself. Oh, there he is.
There we go. Okay. Well, the board is working on programs for the whole spring, and nothing's cast on a set piece yet. We do have a man coming in early April, Jim Kaysen. He has been the General Secretary of Policy for the Friends Committee on National Legislation. He's a journalist in Mexico. He was a leader in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa in the 70s and 80s. He's a friend of my family's. He's going to submit a proposal, but he's been doing research in small Iowa towns, very red places, desperate for immigrants because they're losing businesses because they don't have enough labor. In the town, one town he worked with in Iowa, they lost their, one of their factories went to Mississippi because they needed hundreds of immigrant laborers and they had none. And so he's seen the dynamic of changing thinking about the migrants coming across the border and our actual desperate need for them in many places. So he'll be coming up from Washington, D.C. in early April. So we just have to nail that down. I think Kyle Knight for Human Rights Watch, who has been up before, of course, his mom's on our board, will be coming up again this spring. And there's several other programs in the process.
And you can always check the Mid-Maine Global Forum website to be kept up to date on upcoming events. Thank you, Steve. And the last thing I'll say on behalf of the library is that our next program will be our Maine Town Meeting, which we usually hold in the springtime, usually in May, sometimes in June. We're aiming for May this year. We're aiming for in-person. Hopefully there'll be no snowstorms in May. And we'll probably also have to still offer the hybrid opportunity as well, which is what we did last year with the Maine Town Meeting. The topic that we're looking to focus on this year is the Supreme Court. And one of the speakers who's lined up is a professor of political science at the University of Maine, Farmington, Jim Melcher, who does an amazing presentation every fall on Constitution Day, which is in September, in which he reviews the top 10 Supreme Court cases of the previous term. So he will be giving us that look. And there were a couple of cases that very directly connected to the state of Maine. And then we're looking to have a second speaker as well, who can sort of give us more of historical view of where the Supreme Court is headed ideologically. So be on the lookout for announcements about that program in May. I thank again Mehr for being our speaker today, and I thank all of you for participating through a snowstorm and working around your snowplow guys. And hopefully we'll see you at the library this spring, and if not, we'll see more of you on Zoom. Thank you all very much for participating.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.